complete this job, you'll need a 17mm socket, a 21mm socket, a 7mm hex bit, a T30 Torx bit, ratchets, a torque wrench with the ability to torque up to 150 foot-pounds, a hammer, something to hang the caliper up with, something to compress the piston. I'm using a C-clamp, wire brushes, brake clean, anti-seize, and lubricants. After jacking up the vehicle, you'll want to remove the wheel using the 17mm socket. If the wheel's stuck, just give it a nice kick. I like to put the wheel under the car just for safety. Using a flathead screwdriver, pry off the anti-rattle spring. Don't be afraid to use a little muscle to get it off. Use the T30 Torx bit to remove the rotor set screw. To gain access to the caliper guide pins, you have to remove the dust covers from the rubber boots. This can be done using a small flathead screwdriver. Use the 7mm hex bit to loosen both of the caliper guide pin bolts. To aid in the removal of the caliper, you can use a screwdriver as a pry bar to gently compress the piston in, just enough to allow the caliper to loosen and be removed from the caliper bracket. It's important that once the caliper is removed, you either hang it or put it in a manner in which it's securely fastened. You don't want it to hang by the brake line, as this can cause damage. Use the 21mm socket to remove the bolts for the caliper bracket. These bolts are incredibly tight. You're going to need either a breaker bar, an extendable ratchet like I'm using here, or maybe even an impact. At this point, the rotor should just fall off, unless you live in the Rust Belt, in which case you're going to have to beat it off with a hammer. Good luck! To make future brake jobs a little easier, I'm going to clean the face of the hub off with a wire wheel and apply a healthy coat of anti-seize. Install the new rotor, line up the holes, and install the new set screw, which should have been provided with the rotors. The torque for the set screw is 8 Newton meters or 6 foot-pounds. I'm just going to use the German Gutentite. Now's a good opportunity to clean the bracket up. Just make sure everything is clean so that way the new brake pads will slide freely. The last step before installation is to compress the piston. Leave the old brake pad in the caliper and use a C-clamp to compress the piston. It's also important to mention that prior to this step, you should remove the cap from the brake master cylinder. The inner brake pad is seated into the caliper piston with a spring. It's going to take a little bit of force to pull it out. Reinstall the caliper bracket. The Volkswagen service manual indicates that it's okay to reuse the bolts, provided they're clean and free of damage. The The torque for the caliper bracket bolts is 200 newton meters, which is approximately 147 foot-pounds. Prior to installing the brake pads, you're going to want to remove the caliper guide pins to clean them and relubricate them. Cleaning is as simple as spraying them down with brake cleaner and wiping them off with a clean rag. Because I live in Michigan, I'm going to take the cleaning process a step further and use a soft bristled brush to remove some surface rust from the caliper guide pins. Once the guide pins are clean, apply a healthy layer of lubricant. This is important. Only do this next step if your vehicle is not equipped with a brake pad wear sensor. So my vehicle doesn't have a brake pad wear sensor, but the brake pads include this harness. I'm just going to cut it off. To install the inner brake pad, line up the spring with the hole in the caliper piston and squeeze it into place. Use the brake lubricant to lube up the caliper bracket. And the portion of the brake pad which rides in that groove. Install your brake pad, ensuring that it slides freely. If it gets binded up or stuck, you're going to want to remove that bracket and clean it up more. Now install the caliper by sliding it onto the bracket and fasten the caliper guide pins using the 7mm hex bit. The torque for the caliper guide pins is 25 newton meters or 18 foot-pounds. Reinstall the dust covers. And finally, install the anti-rattle spring. I'm going to be honest with you, this is kind of a pain in the ass. The easiest way for me to get the spring into place is by installing the lower portion of the spring into the hole on the caliper and then getting the spring lined up with the top hole and using either a flathead or just brute strength to get it into place. So I tried to zoom in here to show what I'm doing. I put the spring into that hole. Make sure the spring's on the ear, install the spring into that hole, and just force it up on that ear. The final step is to reinstall your wheel. I was taught a long time ago that it's important to torque the wheel while it's still in the air to half torque. Once the wheel's on the ground, I'm going to torque it to the final torque spec, which is 120 newton meters or 89 foot-pounds.